Hey everyone, I'm Dan Cohen. This is Uncaptured Media, where we strive to stay physically, mentally, and spiritually free from propaganda that seeks to divide and conquer us. And today I'm going to be discussing an article I just published called U.S. Authorizes CIA Mercenaries to Run Biometric Concentration Camps in Gaza Strip. You can read that at my website, uncaptured.media. And I'm going to be joined by a great expert on this subject, Matthew Hoh, who is the Associate Director of the Eisenhower Media Network, Senior Fellow Emeritus with the Center for International Policy. He also ran for the Senate with the Green Party. In 2009, Matthew resigned in protest from his posts in Afghanistan with the State Department over the American escalation of the war. Prior to his assignment in Afghanistan, he took part in the American occupation of Iraq, and he worked on Afghanistan and Iraq war policy and operations at the Pentagon and State Department from 2002 to 2008. So, Matthew, thanks a lot for joining us. I know you have a lot of knowledge directly related to what exactly Israel is planning to do in the Gaza Strip. So I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me join you, Dan, and thanks for reporting on this.
So, this it's a pretty shocking headline, and I mean it's just a shocking story. Basically, to kind of lay it out for our viewers, the Biden administration basically being run by Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, because obviously Biden is not really there mentally, and Kamala Harris doesn't really know what's going on, is busy with her presidential campaign anyway. Jake Sullivan has approved the plan of an Israeli-American businessman named Mordechai Moti, his nickname Kahana, to create a pilot program for what he calls humanitarian bubbles in the Gaza Strip. And this is basically their way to try to supplant Hamas rule in Gaza. So this is, of course, a very flowery name, humanitarian bubbles.
Right.
And, I call them concentration camps in my article. So, Matthew, you have direct experience with this kind of thing. Can you lay out exactly what are these humanitarian bubbles or concentration camps, or however you might term them, and what is the broader strategy that they want to implement here?
And your use of concentration camps is the right terminology, Dan. It's historically accurate as well as just accurate in the reality of what they will do. But the term concentration camp, as people know, goes back 120 years to the British in South Africa, when they put the Boers in concentration camps. And that was an early effort, an early modern effort at what's called population control as a part of a larger counterinsurgency, as we would now call it, but really subjugation or occupation method to pacify the population in order to allow your occupation to continue forward. What you're seeing here with these humanitarian bubbles, as they call them, it's just like the euphemisms just will continue to stretch. So they'll have something similar after this, that's just as grotesque, but the idea, though, is that you are segregating the population, that you're putting them into zones that you control. In this way, everything they require, everything they need, they have to go to you for. Right. So they become dependent upon the occupation. The other aspect is everything about them as well. And particularly now with the technology we have, it's not just about knowing who's there, it's about being able to track them. In addition, as well as tracking them, being able to know who they are associating with. And if people have followed and read the reports, particularly out of Israeli media, as to how the Israelis have utilized that type of tracking, that type of guilt by association, particularly through artificial intelligence programs, and then feeding that into their targeting, into their targeting and killing operations through their drones, or whether it's their ground combat teams. You already know how insidious this is, how dangerous this is, how dystopian it is. And so the idea is essentially to use this type of technology to do better than the Brits did in South Africa, to do better than the Americans did in Vietnam, to do better than we did in Iraq, because we practice population control to a very high degree in Iraq, something I think most people don't know about.
And so basically the strategy that they lay out here is to take villages or neighborhoods and which of course in the Gaza Strip have been totally destroyed, which are just, post-apocalyptic rubblescapes now, and take a population, put them inside there, and surround them with concrete walls, which Kahana, in one interview I came across, he compares to the Israeli separation wall, the apartheid walls that they have, basically all over the West Bank and surrounding parts of the Gaza Strip. And then he says that the only way in and out would be through one entrance, one exit. Only residents of that neighborhood would be allowed in or out, and it would be done through some sort of biometric system. And he doesn't specify what exactly that means, if that's some kind of retinal scan, or if that's like your fingerprint or something else. But and the only people that would be eligible for receiving humanitarian aid would be people who are accepted into this program. So and he also so the people running this would be these 1,000 CIA contractors, which are composed of veterans of American special forces, British, French, and Kurdish, he lays out. And they would be essentially carrying out, they would be trained in crowd control measures, so what they call non-lethal measures, using rubber-coated bullets, I'm sure, tear gas, water, spraying water at people to control them. But then he says that, if they actually carry out some kind of violent attack, or the non-lethal doesn't work, then they have a second team that would carry out lethal attacks that would basically just kill them. So, all of this seems predicated on this, what I see as a faulty idea that you can fundamentally separate the people of Gaza from the resistance movement, which is, of course, Hamas. And not only Hamas, there are a variety of resistance movements that make up actually the Palestinian national movement, or at least the armed wing of it. And so this is predicated on this idea that this is somehow a totally separate phenomenon, and these Palestinians are occupied by these extremists, and we just have to separate them. So is this the same kind of thinking that was employed in Iraq and Afghanistan that you saw?
That's exactly right. And if you go to a conference and they present this idea, if you go to a conference, say in Washington or London or Brussels or Tel Aviv, and they're presenting this idea, which they are doing, this is the type of rhetoric you're going to hear. This is the type of explanation, the rationale, the apology for it is going to be that this helps us separate the insurgents, the resistance, the extremists, the terrorists, whatever you want to call them, from the population. Guiding principle in counterinsurgency or insurgency operations is the idea, and Mao said this, that the insurgent moves through the population like fish moves through water. So if you take the insurgent out of the population, just like you take a fish out of water, it will die. That the insurgent, the freedom fighter, the terrorist, again, whatever you want to call them, right? The resistance is the actual correct term, that the resistance fighters will suffocate if they are removed from the population. They'll lose, of course, because you are taking them away from their base of support. It's a nice idea on paper, but the reality is, as you said, you're getting back to this, the fundamental problem when you're occupying a people is their resistance. And that transcends well beyond just the men and women who may pick up the rifles. I mean, this gets into the whole aspect. And I noted when you opened your show, you talked about uncaptured bodily, emotionally, and spiritually. And this is something that you have to recognize. This is a spirit of resistance, to be uncaptured bodily, emotionally, and spiritually, so that you just may, and I would say historically as well, you may be able to physically separate them, but you're not going to separate the ties that bind them. You're not going to separate, and you're doing nothing to address the legitimate grievances of an occupied people. But this is what the explanation is. This is what the sales pitch is. And this is what they will use to justify the hundreds of millions of dollars that will go into this. You mentioned, just one more thing I wanted to touch on that you mentioned for talk about Iraq and Afghanistan. You mentioned how this will be utilized to ensure who receives humanitarian assistance. And however that's done through a ration card, maybe with an RFID chip in it, maybe an app on the phone. Again, it gets back to this idea of being able to continually surveil and control the population, right? And the population then also becomes dependent upon the occupation to exist. And everything becomes now, in this day and age, everything becomes automated. And, how effective this automation is, certainly wasn't effective on October 7th. The Israelis were relying heavily on automation on their border wall with Gaza. That didn't work. We'll see how well all these stories about how the drones are working against the Palestinians, that type of thing, if that really actually measures out. But that's the one, the automation, these types of people like Kana can make a ton of more money. So if you can automate things, if you can say, I'm not going to have a guy on a wall with a machine gun, I'm going to have an automated robotic machine gun system, you can make a lot more money with that. But that's essentially what they will do. They will automate this. So that when you're talking about non-lethal and lethal responses to the population, it will be done primarily automated through the drones. That's another aspect of the control. You're terrorizing them. So we saw this in Iraq where the drones, we first started using the drones. We have drones called Span Eagles. And these things were like flying lawnmowers, or Scan Eagles, excuse me. These things were like flying lawnmowers, and that's what they sounded like. And when they're over a population for a period of time, and you've seen this in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen, and Pakistan, throughout Africa, and of course in Palestine, now in Lebanon, it terrorizes the population. And it puts them in a constant state of trauma because these killing machines, these robotic killing machines are constantly over them. And because of this connection that you have to have an app in order to get food and water, or carry some type of targeting chip on your rations card, they're always going to know where you are, and they're also always going to know who you're with. And just to go into a little further on that, if people aren't familiar with how the Israeli AI systems have worked, this is how they've been targeting not just resistance fighters in Gaza, but any associates, any family, any friends, any neighbors of the resistance fighter. So one of the AI programs the Israelis use, we know this because of the reporting from Plus 972 magazine, is called Where's Daddy? There's also Gospel and Lavender, are two of the other programs we know about. But with the Where's Daddy program, this AI program, this tells the Israelis when to kill a Palestinian resistance fighter based upon where he is located. Now, in a sane, just, non-criminal, non-evil situation, that would mean that they were killing the resistance fighter when they're away from their families, when they're away from friends and neighbors and community members. The Israelis do the opposite, as we well know. And so what the Where's Daddy program does is it tells the Israelis, now's the time to kill this resistance fighter because he's at home with his family and his children, and we can kill them all together, right? So another aspect of this type of population control is the collective punishment. You've got them all together. You're able to identify them. You're able to target them, and you're able to punish them as you need. So just as we've seen throughout this year, the Israelis can punish the population in a host of ways. And that's what they would do, again, using this automated, very expensive system that will make some people very rich and will be used to immiserate. This is not the idea of counterinsurgency, as most people know, is total garbage. It's a junk science. It's a cult fetish among these war romanticists. And the idea that somehow you're going to get a population to come to love an occupation because you're giving them food or you're building them bridges or you're providing a government for them is just so ahistorical and non-human. It's ridiculous. But the idea about it, though, is that this is how you better subjugate. So it's not about winning hearts and minds. It's simply about subjugation. And this is essentially what we did in Iraq. And in Iraq, and I was a Marine Corps officer in Iraq. I commanded the company of combat engineers in Anbar Province from 2006 to 2007. So my company, we were responsible for doing a lot of this work. building the control points, building the berms, separating the population from the insurgency. We used to call them the AIF, anti-Iraq forces, right? Because that went along with the whole myth, that lie, that, say, the Sunni resistance to the American occupation was foreign, when the reality was 97, 98% of those in the Sunni resistance to the occupation were Iraqis themselves, right? So this idea that somehow they were the anti-Iraqi forces and we were the pro-Iraqi forces, I guess, right? It just shows you how obscene the rationales become in all this, right? And then the rhetoric that attaches itself to it. But the idea was, and we, and as I said to you the other day, Dan, I remember generals and colonels, senior officers saying to us at the time, we're going to be doing population control. We learned this from the Israelis. The Israelis are the experts in this, right? And so people referencing this is 06, 07. So this is before Gaza was put under blockade, but certainly the West Bank was experiencing the apartheid wall, as well as the idea of segregating and making, the West Bank into Swiss cheese, where the Palestinian communities were separated from one another. That does a lot of different things that we discussed. It also means that communities can't support each other. They're not mutually reinforcing. One of the things in the military doctrine is you want to make your enemies' units unable to support one each other. And so this is kind of a military type thinking. It's also further degrees of collective punishment. It's for those degrees of making the population dependent upon the occupation, for its needs, right? So again, very nefarious, insidious stuff. The idea of what we did initially was we brought in these biometric devices. And the idea was a law enforcement type approach to the problem of the insurgency, where we were going to collect biometric data, forensic data, and then we were going to find the people who were building and putting IEDs in the ground. So when an IED, an improvised explosive device, a roadside bomb, would go off, our explosive ordnance disposal teams, EOD, who have been trained in this stuff, they would collect the devices very carefully, and then those devices would get shipped to basically a laboratory. It's still in country. Sometimes they would actually go back to the U.S., and these devices would be assessed for biometric, DNA, fingerprints, that kind of thing, and a database was built. And the idea was that you're going to have control points, traffic control points, right, checkpoints all throughout the country. And so when these insurgents came driving up, they would have to do the biometric test, and it would ping off the database, and you'd nab these guys. And to be fair, to be honest, there was a practical value to that. Once the insurgency, the resistance understood what was happening, they found ways to evade it. But for the first, year or so of it, it was pretty successful if you looked at it in a very objective manner of, yes, we were capturing guys who were building and putting in the ground IEDs because of this method. Now, again, they found ways around it. And then also, to the original point, it did nothing about the legitimate grievances of the resistance. So for every guy we captured or killed who was building an IED or putting an IED in the ground or financing an IED or whatever, they had another guy take his place right away, right? So the fallacy, right? The whole fallacy, the folly of all this, that you're going to kill your way to winning in an occupation. So, what then went further from that, though, was this idea of the population control, of separating the population from the insurgency. And in Anbar Province, they had done this before in other places. In Baghdad, Baghdad became a segregated city because of the civil war that we started, of course, but the civil war between the Sunnis and the Shia. Baghdad, which had been a mixed city, certainly Baghdad had communities and neighborhoods that were predominantly Shia or Sunni, but many parts were mixed. By 05, 06, the city is completely segregated, and these blast walls are put up, to keep the two sides apart was the explanation. But it really was a measure of population control. One way in, one way out of these communities. We're in charge of them. They can't get in and out. They're dependent upon us. We start doing the same thing in Anbar Province. In Anbar, Western Anbar, where we were along the Euphrates River, and so the Euphrates River Valley, you're talking about cities that are, moderate in size for that region. So cities of 50, 100,000 people, maybe less in many cases. Cities that were old. So the city of Hit, where supposedly Abraham, was from, cities that were around for thousands of years, and that are surrounded essentially by desert. And, so we brought in our bulldozers and we put up giant berms around these cities. And this is in the fall of '06, we do this. And there's one way in and one way out. And we're capturing the biometric data of everyone. And so now we also have, besides the fact of maybe finding a guy whose fingerprints was on an IED, because we're starting to capture biometric data, we're starting to link people together, whether actual associates or just family members. And then when you have that, that's leverage you can start applying on the people, right? Just the fear of it, the fear that they know who my mom is a tremendous, tremendous force. So, you see, and then the punishment as well. I remember one time we bermed in a town called Barwana. It's in what we call the Triad. So Hakmania was across the river near Haditha. We didn't allow anything in for 3 or 4 days until the people said, okay, we're cool with this. The people weren't happy being bermed in. They weren't happy being walled in. It was like, it was medieval what we were doing, putting them under siege essentially. And for 3 or 4 days, we didn't let anything in. And people died because of it. They couldn't get their medicine. They couldn't get to the hospital. I know one story I recall, a woman had a miscarriage basically right at our checkpoint because we wouldn't let her go to the hospital. Like that type of stuff. So that type of savagery, right? That type of punishment of the population, clear war crimes, right? This is what we were doing, So, and I'm gonna go on mute because the Amazon guys come up to my door. So, in a second.
No problem. There's a lot to unpack there. One thing that's striking, one parallel in terms of the biometric aspect of this, which is, there's a huge amount of technological innovation that's gone into this field of biometrics for many years, but I think especially since the war on terror era, post 9/11, Iraq, Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera. I also look at Ukraine and the way that I did a report for Redacted, the show Redacted, on DIA, which is this Ukrainian digital ID that through the war they've been able to implement, which is, everything is contained in your phone. Like your entire identity is contained in your phone. And the only way that you could get, financial assistance or whatever was through this phone. So now, you're basically reduced to this identity through your phone. Your entire life is controlled through it. And if you do something that, say, the government doesn't like, then, you can just easily be cut off. And ironically, this is for Ukrainian citizens. This isn't for the so-called enemy population, someone that's under occupation. This is being imposed on Ukrainians by the Ukrainian, by the Zelensky government. They even want to do elections through the smartphone that are just totally opaque. So, even though Zelensky delayed elections, he was pushing for we're going to do elections through the smartphone. So, and there was actually an event here in DC that Samantha Power chaired called DIA in DC, and this is the same kind of thing that they want to implement all over the world, including here in the United States. These digital IDs that are really it's you can see where it's first implemented is in these kind of these so-called humanitarian bubbles, or they also call them gated communities is the other term I've seen, the other flowery term, but which are these military concentration camps for people under occupation in order to try to break their resistance, which obviously doesn't work. The other aspect, we talked about this yesterday on the phone, but that I think is different from the Iraq or Afghanistan experience versus Palestine is the level of just racism and the extreme level of racism in Israeli society, which undoubtedly there was plenty of racism and young guys who just wanted to go to Afghanistan and kill people. I actually had a cousin who several years younger than me that I helped raise, and he ended up joining maybe I can't remember if he was a Marine or what he was, but he ended up being a tanker, and he was just when he was in training in the U.S. he was just so excited to go and kill some Arabs. And so this kind of like young, when you're 20 years old or 18 or 19 years old and you're indoctrinated into that. And that's in the U.S. Army. We're not, I mean, and that's in a faraway place. Whereas Israel, I mean, you're just, since the time you're on the baby's bottle, you're just inculcated with this really genocidal ideology. And we see it on social media constantly. And the place that you're occupying is, 10 or 15 minutes from your home or an hour from your home. And so it's much more in your face. It's not like where, the U.S. could get up and leave Afghanistan and it's on the other side of the world. I expect that it would be a much more kind of severe version of this kind of thing. And, it's obviously, I can't help but, I mean, what we're seeing is genocide in Gaza. There's no doubt about it. But I mean, this idea. Okay, there are a couple things. One, this is the strategy that actually the U.S. has pretty much developed. This didn't originate in Israel, as far as I can tell from the reporting that I've seen. This idea is the U.S. trying to basically convince Israel to take on this kind of program, because Israel's been like bent on total ethnic cleansing of Gaza, but that hasn't worked for a variety of reasons. One, Egypt and various other countries do not want to take in a massive refugee population for their own internal considerations. Second, Palestinians are largely unwilling. They're not going to leave. We haven't seen some kind of massive rush of people towards the Rafah crossing, even before the Israelis destroyed it, as if everyone wants to get out. People largely, even in northern Gaza, which has been being ethnically cleansed right now, you have to remove people, at gunpoint and just terrorize them and kill them. That's what the Israelis are doing, literally as we speak. So with the failure of Israel to achieve its real goal of ethnic cleansing, its stated goal of defeating Hamas, which it hasn't done. I mean, Hamas continues to be, it's not even an insurgency where it's just totally disconnected. They're really operating, they continue to operate as basically a national military, where they have, throughout their tunnel system, throughout Gaza, they have phone lines between commanders who are watching on camera, directing, a team of basically soldiers to carry out some kind of operation. And, they do it and then disappear into the tunnels like ghosts. And there's not a lot of actual face-to-face combat, but nonetheless, they have not been significantly degraded to the point where it's an actual just insurgency. So it seems like this is kind of a response from the U.S. that it's trying to convince Israel to do, a response to Israel's failure to achieve its stated goals. And almost, I don't know, do you see this as kind of a failure of Israel in a way?
Well, I mean, certainly depends on what lens you're looking through, what glasses you've had on. If you are, and is like many in Israel politics, in the media, in their society, this is once, as Naftali Bennett said just a couple weeks ago, and others have said all throughout the year, this is a once in a 50-year opportunity. So it depends upon how you want to measure this. For the Israelis who are either militarists, nationalists, whether they're secular or religious, if they're, how much of a Zionist they are, how much they believe in the greater Israel project, this is an opportunity. And so a year on after this, they are in a better place, because look at what they're achieving. Look what they have the capacity to achieve. You now have the Americans saying, you know what, we're going to help you out with this program to further subjugate the Palestinian people. This is what you choose to go with. And that seems to be the two poles we're dealing with here, Dan, with Israel right now. One, in terms of what the future is for Gaza, is either on one end military occupation, and on the other complete ethnic cleansing and settlement. And that seems to be the window within which any options are available. There's no, I think a lot of people, myself included, had this idea that there are some who might be able to come to power in Israel, maybe a Benny Gantz or someone who would ultimately just rewind the clock back to October 6th. No matter how terrible that is, at least it would be kind of a resetting to non-genocide, right? But it doesn't even seem that's like an option. That doesn't even seem like Gantz or Lapid or anyone who has any possibility of getting into power would even entertain such a thing. At best, you're just going to see a military occupation. And so here you have the Americans, as you say, saying, "Hey, we're happy to help you with this. We want to provide this type of support. We want to further this. We want to give you our best technology." I mean, some of this you get into the military-industrial complex itself. The idea of you always want to be selling higher end, more complex, more sophisticated, more expensive solutions to problems. So I just a quick story. Years ago in 2008, I was leading a counter-suicide bomber team for the Department of Defense. And we were looking at all these technologies to see if we could spot suicide bombers before they hit our troops or hit, whatever. And the only thing that reliably worked, nothing else worked. We had tested dozens of different types of devices. Nothing worked. But the only thing that reliably worked were two things. One, your standard metal detector that you have in a courthouse, $3,000, plug it in the wall, you're good to go. And then the $450,000 imaging machines you have in the airport. Those are the only two things that would actually work to find a suicide bomber. What self-respecting suicide bomber, of course, is going to walk through one of those? That's another issue. But I remember briefing this and saying, these are what we have. And being told by our deputy director, like, Matt, I appreciate this, but no one is going to go for a solution that doesn't cost a lot of money. Right. So your $3,000 X-ray machines we can't even entertain that because they don't cost enough. I mean, that's the reality of the military industrial complex. I think probably a lot of different acquisition programs as well, or organizations, but definitely for the military. So you want to be selling these high dollar, big ticket, expensive, tech heavy things because that's where the industry lays. That's what they want. It's also too, it's this type of magic bullet wonder weapon. Right. So similar to what we've seen in the Ukraine, where it's one wonder weapon after another being introduced that's going to win the war, turn the tides of the war. This idea, this will be the solution to the problem. We're going to come in. All the Palestinians are going to have apps on their phones. This is how they're going to get their food. It's going to be our way to keep track of them, keep them safe, keep them separate from Hamas. And we'll be able to deliver all this humanitarian assistance to them. And then we'll have all these metrics and we'll be able to see where in real time they need more food and water, on and on and on, all this nonsense. When again, the ability is to track people, target them, associate them with others. I mean, we've seen this already, Dan. I mean, people remember 4 years ago during COVID, we had these things on our phones, right? Many of us did these COVID tracking things where working off of Bluetooth, you were in a supermarket. If somebody you passed, your phones would talk to each other and you note that you passed this person. And then later on, if you had COVID and you reported it, your phone would then tell all the other phones in the last 10 days that you were passing that you have COVID and they need to go get checked out. So, the technology is there. It's been demonstrated and it's easy to apply. And once you've got something like that on someone's phone, then you have access to everything. And so again, this idea is that once you have it on a mother's phone, then you know what her sons are up to. You can target everyone in the family. In this way, you can control them better, again, through fear. So again, it's really insidious, really dystopian, what's being presented here. And the fact that Samantha Power and USAID and others are presenting this in the guise with the window dressing that this is humanitarian assistance, a more effective, more efficient, more modern way of doing it, it just really shows just how dangerous of an organization USAID is. Long has been, of course. People know familiar with what USAID did in Central America, what they did in Vietnam. So, the other thing too you touched on, I just want to point out, you talked about U.S. troops that were in Iraq and Afghanistan, and particularly in the infantry. Yeah, those kids wanted to go over and kill because that was the culture. And you weren't anything until you had killed somebody. What kind of Marine or soldier are you without before you're killed? Then, of course, there's a whole 9/11 thing. We're going there for revenge, protect our people. We've got to fight them over there, so we don't have to fight them here. And then, too, just the general Islamophobia and racism that exists in American society, but nothing compared to what the Israelis are like. What you're talking about here, though, in a sense of using contractors to do this. So at least with the American forces, while most Americans join the military, or a good amount of Americans join the military because of the poverty draft for economic reasons, a lot do join because they are well-intentioned. They may be misguided, but they are well-intentioned. They think that they're going to be going overseas to wear a white hat because this is what society. This is what their education system, this is what the entertainment, this is what everyone tells them. And this is why so many of us, when we go over there, we end up having moral injury because we realize we're not wearing a white hat, we're wearing a black hat. But, with contractors, though, there's none of that. Nothing is going to hedge on these guys. These guys are signing up to go and do population control. They know exactly what it means. They're going for the money, and they couldn't care less what actually happens to these people. So the bouts of conscience, anyone doing the right thing, any type of moral qualms that you might find within the military, you are not going to see at all among a contracted force. It's one of the reasons why contracted forces are preferred, because they are self-selecting in many ways of who they bring on. These are people who are they're already seasoned. They've already got experience. They've already gone to Iraq and Afghanistan and done this to people. They're cool with it. They're going to make a lot of money. So you're not going to have any problems. You're going to get no Chelsea Mannings coming out of these types of programs, right? So, there's so much. I'm so glad you brought this up, because there is so much, it just seems very simple. Okay, they're just going to give people ration cards with RFID trackers. They're going to be an app on their phone, and they're going to have these walls around it, and it's going to be awful. It's going to be a concentration camp, but it goes much farther than that. And it goes to show what the purposes are. If the Israelis choose not to go with either partial or full resettlement of Gaza, this is what it's going to look like. And this is what it eventually will look like in West Bank. It's already partially like this in the West Bank, but this is what it will look like in West Bank, and this is what it will look like in Lebanon as well. So we're seeing what the future looks like, and it is just meant purely as a means of subjugation and for no other reasons than, the name of it's called, population control.
Right. And I mean, to your point, this guy Moti Kahana describing these CIA trained or approved former special forces, he says that they are, quote, war addicts.
Yeah.
I mean, just what a term, war addicts. And he says they all have at least 25 years of experience and are, quote, people who like to fight bad people. So,
right.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, these are not guys who are green behind the ears, who are, who have been imagining what war is like, and suddenly they're going to experience it and go into some kind of shock or something like that. These guys they've killed
right.
plenty of people. They know what it feels like to kill someone, and then maybe they even like it because they, for whatever reason.
Because they're psychopaths, Dan. I mean, that's essentially what they are. They're psychopaths. I mean, this is who they are. Most who go into the military, they go through it, they come out, and they decide not to do it again. Others stay in with this misconception that they're going to do things better, and so forth. And some do enjoy it. Some enjoy the killing. Some enjoy the power that the killing brings. And then with the contractors, with the mercenaries, you have this ability to also make a lot of money and to do it without any restrictions. The Uniform Code of Military Justice doesn't apply to contractors. And American courts have no jurisdiction over American contractors in foreign countries. So if you want to go and murder someone in a foreign country, become a mercenary, become a contractor, sign up, do the work of the CIA or the Department of Defense or the Israelis in a foreign country, you can murder people with impunity because there's no one governing you. There's no one overseeing you. There's no one who has any ability to hold you to account. And this is one of the modern ways of American warfare. Right. So starting in the second half of the Obama administration, you have this great shift in the way America fights its wars. Bush administration, political disaster for them invading Iraq. The Obama administration doesn't receive the political disaster of Afghanistan it should have had because Obama smartly starts drawing down the troops in 2011. But even so, by 2013, the Afghan war is the most unpopular war in American history. It's more unpopular in the polling than Vietnam or Iraq ever was. But the Democrats are able, partially because also the Great Recession, 10 million Americans losing their homes, people are paying attention to that as opposed to the Afghan war. But what this shows the Democrats, though, is even though we got away with it, we got through 2010 they got crushed in 2010, but we got reelected in 2012 without Afghanistan being a weight around us. We just got lucky. We're already drawing down. So when Afghanistan came up during that election, it was always, we're pulling our troops out, which they were at the time. But the idea was we can't have American troops on the ground taking casualties. It's politically it's politically impossible for the Americans to do this. Right. So what they do starting in the Obama administration is you start changing the way of American warfare. You use proxies, you use special operations forces, you use classified drone programs, and you use contractors, right? Because the contractors are unaccountable. It is also a plausible deniability with them as well. Who actually hired these guys? You can have that. But even if there is a line back to the CIA, back to the Department of Defense, back to the State Department, whoever, well, who's accountable for it? Worst that happens is you stop, you don't give these guys another contract, and they change their name and they get another contract, just like Blackwater has, right? But we've seen, say, with the khaki program, CACI, those people tortured people in Iraq. And decades after that, decades after those lawsuits began, there's been no accountability because it continues to come back to this thing of American courts don't have sovereignty overseas. So it is brilliant in the ability to perpetuate and carry out wars overseas without suffering any type of consequences, politically here in the U.S. And so this is why you see, and it shows too, right? During the Iraq War, your ratio of soldiers to contractors goes from roughly 2 or 3 soldiers to 1 contractor, and it starts to even out. By the time of Obama's escalation of the Afghan war, it's 1-to-1. So when there are 100,000 American troops in Afghanistan, there's 100,000 contractors. By the time the U.S. is getting out of Afghanistan, the ratio is close to, if I remember correctly, about 10-to-1, 8-to-1 or 9-to-1 or something like that of contractors to troops. You look at the number of American troops in Iraq right now, about 2,500. There's roughly about 7 or 8 times as many contractors there. So by doing this, you're able to get around, and contractors don't count. So one more thing, just to talk about the contractors about this, why it's so important, is in Afghanistan and Iraq, you had 7,000 American service members killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. You had 8,000 contractors killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Nobody knows this. Nobody talks about that. So those 8,000 contractors who were killed in Iraq and Afghanistan in any previous war, say like in Vietnam, those men and women would have been wearing American military uniforms, right? So rather than the actual toll of who was killed in Iraq and Afghanistan being 15,000, it's only 7,000 because the 8,000 contractors, even though they were doing the job of the military, simply don't count.
Right. And I mean, to the point you made, one of the points you made earlier, Kahana talks about why have foreign contract. I mean, he gives a couple reasons for having foreign contractors come in rather than just Israeli soldiers directly doing it. One, he says Israeli soldiers will just kill people. They'll just straight up kill them. Which he gives the example of the flower massacre back in late February when Palestinians were waiting at an intersection for a food aid delivery, and the Israeli soldiers just opened fire and killed something like 116 or 118 people and wounded like 700. And so I think, basically, well, let's try to avoid that, and we'll just have these contractors do it. And one of the other reasons he gives, which is just so stupid, is he specifically says none of these contractors will be Jews. So then no one can say, oh, look what the Jews are doing, as if the Jews Jews equal Zionists or Jews equal Israeli soldiers or contractors or whatever. That's the same thing. So it's just such a crazy justification.
Right.
One of the people who's been promoting this strategy, the counterinsurgency strategy for Gaza for several months, maybe even back to just after October 7th. I mean, I'm still researching this, and who's been in the media? He just this is David Petraeus, who led the Iraq surge, and then of course was the disgraced short-term CIA director until he was exposed for giving classified information to a woman who he was having an affair with.
Right.
But he was there was an article published yesterday on Wednesday, October 23rd in Foreign Policy, where he's interviewed about why the Israelis have to embrace this counterinsurgency model. He's written in Foreign Affairs, all the top journals interviewed in the Washington Post about why the Israelis must embrace this. So it seems like, I mean, he's kind of the face of it, but it's really, a broader kind of It seems like kind of the deep state is trying to get the Israelis to embrace this because they basically see that, it's not, the Israelis are not achieving their goals otherwise. And, maybe, I don't know. They're so, but I mean, what is it? Yeah. What does it say to you that, Petraeus is being kind of held up to promote this?
Well, I mean, it's just, first of all, just the fact that he still is published the way he is and he still commands that type of respect. You and I, Foreign Affairs, would never publish anything we wrote, Dan, no matter what it was. I mean, David Petraeus, he could write about how the Chicago White Sox were the best team in baseball last year. If people aren't familiar, they had the worst record in the history of baseball. I think they finished with the worst record in history of baseball. They were close to it if they didn't. But that's a type of just, this is so insane. I mean, this man has failed over and over and over again. His character is atrocious. He's he's been proven to be a liar over and over again. And he still commands the respect. He still gets published. Now you're getting into this idea of the elites in the United States. He sits in several different categories of elites, the bubbles of the elites. So he's in academia, he's in finance, he's in the military industrial complex. He really, when people, if people are familiar, I'm a big fan of C. Wright Mills, who was a sociologist in the 1950s. In terms of my understanding of the American system, the American empire, what Mills wrote about the American elites in the 50s still holds true. But this type of relationship. And so even if they are just saying stuff that is just completely unfounded, just that, not even ancient history, we're not talking about going back. We're not even talking about going back to, say, the British in South Africa or the Americans in Vietnam. We're talking about going back to just 20 years ago, what we did in Iraq, 15 years ago, what we did in Afghanistan. And the fact that he's able to promote these things without that type of criticism, it shows just how captured the whole thing is. And so this idea that anything other is going to happen to the Palestinian people, that the Palestinian people are going to suffer anything other than this type of humiliation, this degradation, this type of occupation and oppression, that's what it's telling us. That someone like Petraeus is able to sell this snake oil again, that it's been so disproved time and time again, and there's no counter to it. And then again, the amount of money that's being made off of it, the rationales, the explanations, you will have well, I mean, one of the things you brought up before, just to get into the kind of counterinsurgency and how nutso the whole idea is, when he says there aren't going to be any Jews among these contractors, it's this idea that, well, this way the Palestinian people will accept them because the Palestinian people are vilely anti-Semitic. And so no matter what the Israelis do, they will never be accepted. But if you bring in non-Jews, right, then the Palestinian people will be more open to them. They'll be more amenable. This is a crackpot idea. It's the same type of crackpot nonsense about bringing in peacekeeping troops from Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and the Emiratis or whatever these crazy ideas are to govern the Gaza Strip. But that's the type of thinking these people have. And some of them actually do believe this. Some of them actually are true believers. Others are like, this is the explanation. This is the excuse I need to go along with it because it meets my interests. It meets my, donors' interests. This is in the interests of our parent corporations or the banks that own our parent corporations, right? So you just see how all this continues to roll with a macro explanation of why is it continuing to go on. And it is. I mean, this thing, it's in what we're almost talking about, go back to this point, I think, this seems almost, and this is disgusting to say, I know, right? This is really obscene, but this is almost like best case. This is almost like best case for the Palestinians, particularly in North Gaza, that if this is what the culmination of what's called the general's plan, this is what supposedly is what the Israelis are enacting right now in northern Gaza, this surrender or starve type of policy, right? Which Israeli soldiers have come out to Israeli media in the last week saying we are truly enacting ethnic cleansing, right? This might be best case for the Palestinians. Again, that's disgusting. It's obscene. It's horrifying as to say, because, they're remaining in Gaza. They're remaining in North Gaza, right? Again, I feel terrible even saying those types of words, but where we're at right now with what's happening to the Palestinians and what will continue to happen because of the support of the United States means that this is one end of the spectrum of what can happen to the Palestinians. Of course, the other side of that spectrum being the full ethnic cleansing, the full settlement of Gaza by the Israelis. So, I'm not, I think everyone understands what I'm trying to communicate there. But yeah, I mean, this plan, no matter way you unwrap it, the way you look at it, it's just one money-making, crackpot, racist, imperial fever dream that is being put into motion here.
Right. And I mean, to your point, I get exactly what you're saying. This is actually how both Moti Kahana, the owner of this private company, and David Petraeus are portraying it, that it's actually some benevolent thing for the Palestinians, that, they'll get humanitarian aid. And I mean, I'll just read this quote from Petraeus's foreign policy interview. He says, if that's done, meaning these so-called gated communities, if Palestinians are forced into these biometric concentration camps, then you'll see Arab forces willing to come in. So basically, you'll get whatever it is. I mean, they're imagining they'll get I don't know, whatever Emiratis or whatever kind of foreign force to come in and police. You could bring in Palestinian security forces that are trained and equipped by the United States and the Jordanians at the International Police Training Center. You'll see NGOs and international organizations in there. And only if there's security can you do what I've laid out. And only then is there a better future for the Palestinian people, with the possibility that Palestinians in Gaza can live side by side with their Israeli neighbors in peace. So this is the U.S. peace plan for Gaza, is rather than just a direct ethnic cleansing and genocide, it'll be temporary. Everything's, there's going to be a huge amount of massacres. Yes, we accept all that, but some of you will be able to come back and live in these, as basically slaves in these concentration camps, where you'll be, if you don't act up, you'll be given a bit of food and water, and
they'll be completely separated from the other communities. So however they need, right? I mean, so that there will be isolation. It'll be complete isolation within your concrete containment, within your concentration camp. You will have no contact, and it's the other way too, is that people, they can control the internet this way. Right. They can control everything going in and out. And that doesn't just mean physical bodies, doesn't just mean material and resources. It means any type of communication. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. I mean, this is their benevolent plan. There's a comment from the Israeli member of Knesset, Amit Halevi, who's actually in Netanyahu's Likud party, but he's more of a religious Zionist, which there's sort of been a takeover of religious Zionism inside Likud over the past, say, 20 years. But, as you can imagine, the Israeli right wing, the like hard right wing, is totally opposed to this plan, because this is kind of like the liberal plan. It's either genocide or concentration camps.
That's exactly right. That's the best way to put it. Right. I would say a military occupation to settlement, but actually the reality is saying that those two poles that we're dealing with here are concentration camps and genocide. Yeah.
Right. That's the so the genocide camp here is this guy Amit Halevi, who again is a member of Knesset for the Likud party, and he sits on the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, and he put out some posts on Telegram calling it a strange and stupid plan that's unacceptable. He says, this means that an American company will serve as a cover for the development of the neo-Nazi monster of Hamas, with the permission and patronage of the State of Israel after October 7th. So he understands that actually this plan is not going to work, that it's going to fail, that people are going to find ways to resist no matter what.
Right.
He says,
and it's actually going to, and to his point, I wouldn't use the term create neo-Nazi, blah, 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 but he is, as you were saying, he is correct, Dan. It will increase the resistance. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so he says,
and resistance often when you push at people like that, when you give them less options, they reach for more extreme right? They have to, what's available to them. And oftentimes it turns to be more extreme as well. So he is correct as that. You're going to have a more extreme resistance because of the pressures you're putting on the society through your occupation. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think, if when I look at his whole post, though, what he is proposing is basically that the Israelis have to have a total occupation of the Gaza Strip, no foreigners, because that's an affront to the sovereignty of Israel, for one thing, and then basically you just re-educate the Palestinians, change their school textbooks, have your installed sheikhs, religious leaders preaching exactly what the Israelis want, this kind of thing. And to be fair, that's actually what this model, I mean, as you were saying, this is exactly what has been done in the West Bank. And when I was in Palestine recently, I was talking to a friend who kind of described how, in Ramallah, a fair amount of people, and throughout parts of the West Bank, I mean, obviously not everyone, there's very strong support for resistance, but people have been indoctrinated with some of this kind of thinking. But it's hard to imagine that this could ever succeed to any degree in Gaza. And
just to tell you like a family story, if I may, my grandmother grew up in Ireland, and as a young girl, as a young woman, our family was in the IRA in Tipperary, and when she was a schoolgirl, and years later, when she went back to Ireland, she showed the nuns in the schools where they used to hide the Gaelic textbooks, because the British banned the teaching of the Irish language. They banned teaching Irish history. And all they simply did was they just had books that they'd hide when the British would come around. I mean, so this is something that's been tried. It's not going to work. It's simply not going to work. The only thing that works is addressing the grievances of the resistance, of the occupation, and meeting the needs of free and liberated people. That's simply it.
Right, exactly. And so Halevi, he also says, what is the logic of allowing restoration before we have completed the full purification? So I think which sounds, he's referring to ethnic cleansing. So, no, I mean, it's, so it's, I don't know if this thing is actually, Netanyahu is going to sign off on it. It's been presented to him for several months, at least since March, is when it was first presented to him. And, there are elements in the military who do agree with this, because I think, among the military, they realize that the longer this war goes on, the more, they're losing soldiers, and Israel's not that big of a country. I mean, there's 6 million Jewish Israelis, so that's not that large of a military overall. They've taken a lot of losses that they're not used to. Their economy is hemorrhaging. A lot of people are leaving, and the more productive people, sectors of society, they're leaving the country. So Israel's kind of, on the path to becoming a failed state. There's the Israeli general Yitzhak Brik, who keeps warning, and this is the guy who basically predicted October 7th and was correct about that. He's been warning that, if this war goes on, Israel is going to collapse. So who knows what the future holds here, but I think we'll leave it there. So Matthew, Hoh, thank you so much for your time, your expertise, and look forward to doing it again.
Hey, thank you, Dan, and I appreciate the work you do. Thank you very much.